Hi, and I hope everyone's doing well this week. I'm excited about what we're going to be experiencing this month as we think about God as Trinity, as Father, as Son, as Spirit. Not just because it's a fascinating subject to think about, which I believe it is, but because a deeper understanding of God can help us as we seek to relate to Him ourselves. So our focus as we think about the Trinity will be on relationship, thinking about how we're called to relate to the Father, how to relate to the Son, how to relate to the Spirit as they choose to relate to us. But to start us off, we're going to think about the Trinity as a whole, a big picture basis for what we're going to look at next. And there is much that we will leave unsaid. There is so much to say. There is so much we will recognise that we simply don't understand. But my prayer is that as we reflect on what some of the Bible reveals about our wonderful and mysterious God, that we will be drawn closer to Him and we'll appreciate Him more and more. One of the foundational beliefs of God's people in the Old Testament was that there was one God. This was less a statement that there weren't other gods. They recognised that other nations worshipped gods and idols, and they themselves did on occasion as they turned away from this God. But at their best, they recognised that their God was unique and supreme. No other came anywhere close. And so while all other nations worshipped many gods, they just worshipped one. The one who had revealed himself to them in creation, in rescue, in redemption, in provision, in blessing. And one of the challenges that the first followers of Jesus and those who wrote our New Testament had was a realization that this person, Jesus, shared in the identity of this God. And so they had to try and come up with ways of expressing this idea in terms that were faithful to God and their belief in one God, but also recognized the full deity of Jesus. So we have records of Jesus claiming to be the same as the Father. In John 10:30, I and the Father are one. And that caused those listening to his words to try and stone him to death for claiming equality with God. And this was indeed the required response to blasphemy. So if Jesus had not been who he was, the crowds would have been right in following through what they attempted. But he was who he was, and that changes everything. We also see Jesus as the one who created all things, John 1:3 and Hebrews 1:2. John's Gospel refers to him as the Word who was always with God, was God, and made everything. So while Genesis has God speaking and things coming into existence, the New Testament adds to our understanding by explaining that the Word that caused things to exist was actually God the Son acting in creation on behalf of his Father. So here and throughout the New Testament, we're starting to see the working out of a deeper understanding of this nature of God, which continued through the early centuries of Christianity. Recognizing the full divinity of Jesus, recognizing the full divinity of the Spirit, formulating the doctrine of the Trinity, the idea of God being three in one, to try and have some way of grasping these concepts. And as we look closely at the New Testament, the central focus seems to be on Jesus and how the other members of the Trinity relate to him. In particular, we're presented with new descriptions for God, no longer with the focus on the one who called Abraham, who rescued his people from Egypt, who brought them into the promised land, but more about how he sent Jesus and then raised him from the dead. Romans 4:24 speaks about God for us who believe in him, who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. Yes, he of course was still the same God who had created, who had called, who had rescued his people in the past. But the focus now is on what he has done for his Son, and through him, for his people. He is now known, among other things, as the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In the first few verses of Galatians 4, we see God, whom we identify as the Father, involved in two sending acts. In verse 5, we see that he sent his Son to redeem us so that we could be adopted into his family, brought into that privileged relationship alongside Jesus. And the NIV has adoption to sonship. The underlying text simply has adoption, which speaks of the privilege of someone, normally a son in those times, being brought into a full family relationship with the Father and someone who would receive an inheritance along with all the other children. So it includes all of us who believe in Jesus. And then in verse 6, he sends the Spirit of his Son into our hearts so that we could know him as Father. And based on what Jesus says to his followers in John 14-16, we know that this person will come and live inside us and point us to Jesus. Jesus was someone who walked with, who talked with his followers, someone who was God among them. The Spirit is God inside us and fills us with an awareness of God. What Paul is showing us here is that the God who we see as one, when we look from the outside, is shown as a trinity of persons, three persons in one, once we get to know him and experience him for ourselves. If what we see in these verses in Galatians is God the Father sending the Son, God the Father sending the Spirit, what do we see as we look at other ways in which members of the Trinity act on each other? If we look at what the New Testament as a whole says about the Father acting in relation to the Son, we see a fascinating split. In the Gospels, the major emphasis is on the Father sending the Son. And that's what the Gospel writers seem most interested in. The realization that God sent his Son into this world, that God did not stay above their situation and lives, but chose to enter into it in the person of his Son. And this is picked up in later New Testament books, but only a small amount. Twice in Acts, 3 times in 1 John, whereas it occurs 36 times in the Gospels. This seems to be what they grasped and got excited about. One of the other themes we see only in John's Gospel is the explicit idea of the Father loving the Son. Yes, that is true, but everywhere. But we see it specifically spoken about in a deep way in John's Gospel. In the later New Testament, the focus shifts less on the Father sending the Son, but more on the Father raising the Son from the dead. And this is spoken about 24 times. When we look the other way round and think of the Son acting towards or in relation to the Father, the major thing we see is Jesus speaking about knowing God, obeying God, making him known, with that priority of communicating God in a new and fresh way to the people to whom he was speaking and living amongst. And here, Jesus is claiming a unique relationship with God, something that was only possible because of who he himself was. There is much less said about the Father acting on the Spirit, but they all speak about God the Father sending the Spirit, in most cases to those who have believed in Jesus, in order to help, to guide, to show how to live and to show we are in relationship with him. And I can't find any places where the Spirit is spoken of as acting towards the Father. The emphasis is on the Father sending the Spirit to us. I can find just 3 references where we see the Son acting in relation to the Spirit. In Matthew's Gospel, in verse 3:16, just after his baptism, Jesus sees the Spirit coming down like a dove to rest on him. A foretaste of the way in which the Spirit was going to be present in the life of Jesus through his ministry. In John's Gospel, in chapter 15:26 and 16:7, Jesus is speaking about the Father sending the Spirit. He's speaking about the Father sending the Spirit, or Jesus himself directly sending the Spirit to his followers. So it's always the idea of causing the Spirit to come to be amongst the followers of Jesus. 3 times the Spirit acts in relation to the Son. He sends him into the wilderness for his 40 days of temptation. We find this in Mark 1. We find that when the Spirit comes, he will remind the followers of Jesus about what Jesus has told them. This is in John 14:26. And he will glorify Jesus. Taking all of this together, we get a big picture view of how the 3 persons of the Trinity work together in showing themselves to us, of working together to draw us into relationship with themselves. We see something of their own relationship, the love, the deep love of the Father for his Son. We see the desire of the Spirit to point people to Jesus and for him to be glorified. And we see the deep relationship that the Son has with the Father, his desire to obey him and to make him known. And it is in Jesus that we get a fuller understanding of who God really is. We see the power of God in raising his Son to life, demonstrating that he had defeated sin and death, giving us hope for our own future, our future resurrection to be like him. We see the generosity of God, first in sending his Son to redeem and to save, and then in sending his Spirit to give us new life, based on what the Son achieved in his life, in his death, in his resurrection. This is the God who has revealed himself to us, who loves us, who died for us, who lives in us, who leads us, who guides us. Let's rejoice in him. Let's worship him. Let's recognize who he is. Let's think about how much he has done for us and think about what he is calling us to do in response. Here are some questions to think about. How does an understanding of God as 3 in 1 affect how you think of him? How do you relate to the different persons of the Trinity? And how would you explain the Trinity to someone else?